Go ahead and go to 2 Kings. Essentially, God is making good on the promises that He said was going to happen several years beforehand. And that some of the, wickedness that these kings that were, some things they were doing that were out of the will of God and that were against the will of God. He had Elijah and had Elisha as well coming to them and telling them that there are going to be consequences because of your actions. And what we have done now through 2 Kings, starting with chapters 9, and in 2 Chronicles as well, and 10, chapters 11, and kind of as we've been going through this, we've been seeing how God has been making good on His promises to take care of or get rid of some of these kings and their lines and their heirs as well. So chapter 9 of 2 Kings was a couple of weeks ago. We saw the death of Ahab's heirs and how exactly that took place. Last week we looked at the death of Ahab's house, verses 1 through 17 of chapter 10. And then we saw Jezebel being thrown down as well. And then we finished up last week by looking at the death of Ahab's heretics. And if you remember, Jehu came in and he essentially said, we're going to have this really big celebration. We're going to have this really big time of worship to Baal. And he had all of the people that were followers of Baal come into the synagogue, or not the synagogue, but the temple of worship that they had set up for him. And then they had all of them kind of killed. All right, had this men set up outside so nobody could escape, and all of those guys and ladies and men and all those people who were followers of Baal were slain and were killed because God had kind of told him to make sure and take care of that. But as we finished up chapter 10 last week, we saw that even which was the next part of this, even though Jehu carried out God's plans the way in which He wanted him to most of the time, Jehu himself was not a total and complete follower of God. Right? He still worshipped the golden calves, still followed the ways of Jeroboam, and because of that, the end of his reign was filled with trouble, filled with difficulties and different things that were going on because he wasn't completely and entirely giving himself over and completely. And what we finished up with as we kind of closed out chapter 10 last week was, Jehu was a man who did what God wanted him to do, and God blessed his family because of it. But also Jehu was a man that wasn't totally sold out to worshiping God, and we saw the consequences of that. But also, it was a little bit of a refreshing look for us as well, because God will use and can use and still uses imperfect people. Right now, Jehu's his sins and the things that he was doing against God were of the course of his own will, and he knew better. But yet, God still was able to use this imperfect individual to carry out the plans. Right, which refreshing for us that God would still is still willing to use us, imperfect people, and knowing that we're going to continue to do some things that He's not going to be happy with to use. He can use us, but also those imperfect things that we have in our life, those sins we have in our life, we guarantee that God's going to judge those sins because that's who God is and what God has to do. Okay, so that brought us down through chapter 10, and we'll start chapter 11 today. As you can see, we got to go through chapters 11, chapters 12, and over into 2 Chronicles as well. And we're going to continue to see the sovereignty of God protecting the line of David, which He promised him many moons ago, right, up to this point, as we're looking through the history of the nation of Israel. So let's go to chapter 11 of 2 Kings, and we'll read through first 3 verses, and we see our next king in the line, Joash. Chapter 11, first 3 verses here, we see the protection of Joash. And when Athaliah, the mother of Ahaziah, saw that her son was dead, she arose and destroyed all the seed royal. But Jehoshaphat, the daughter of King Joram, sister of Ahaziah, took Joash, the son of Ahaziah, and stole him. Athaliah. He was with her, hid in the house of the Lord for 6 years, and Athaliah did reign over the land. So we see now the first 3 verses here, 2 Kings chapter 11, that King Ahaziah, of course, the king of Judah, was the son of Athaliah, and these were the parents, were Ahab and Jezebel. Okay, so this is who we're talking about, who we're seeing here now. So now Jehu over in 2 Kings of chapter 9 and 10, of course, has executed and got rid of King Ahaziah. Athaliah put to death or killed all of the other sons of Ahaziah, with the exception of Joash. Okay, Joash was hidden from her. They managed to get him out and was hidden from her until 7 years, 22, verses 10 all the way through 2 Chronicles chapter 23. We're not going to flip over there and read that just yet. But she essentially, during her reign, you can read this in 2 Chronicles, brought nothing but destruction and disaster to the entirety of the southern kingdom. Okay, so that's what she was doing while 7 years of Joash was kind of waiting. While she was going through this reign of destruction, God was promised to protecting, as we've been looking at the studies. Joash, with this destruction reign that was going on that she was doing. Who else, during kind of history of things here, who else did Satan try to destroy as a means of ruining God's plans? Correct. Who else? What are some of the other ways in which Satan tried to destroy this God's plans? Let's go back to Genesis for a second. All right, who did David try to destroy? If you think, not David, it's Satan in Genesis. The hand of Pharaoh. Okay. Who else? King David, right? What ways and Saul and correct, and Goliath was there too. Correct. There's another way. Saul, and then Christ as a child by the hand of Herod are all instances and examples of Satan trying to destroy or to thwart God's plan. And the contrast here between God and the false god that we've been seeing through all of this is that Baal, of course, as we saw last week, had no power, no ability as worshipers in his temple. On the other side of this, now we've got this young child, Joash, for 7 years that God has divinely protected to help set up and make sure the line of David stayed true. And God protected Joash in his orders for 6 years. Okay, and then of course, the temple of God would have been a good place for Joash to stay because Athaliah here, she's probably not showing up in the temple very much at all, right? She's spending time there at all, hardly. So having Joash in the temple was a safe place to be because she was not going to come. She had no interest and no desire to come in and worship God as well. So for 6 years, God is divinely protecting Joash while Athaliah is here doing all the stuff she's kind of doing. Let's go to verse 4 here of chapter 11. And we see now the protection of Joash first, and then after the time he's spent in protection or spent in hiding here, God brings him, and we see the presentation of Joash as king. Verse 4, and in the 7th year of Jehoiada, sent and fetched rulers over hundreds, and with captains and the guard, and brought them to him into the house of the Lord, and made a covenant with them, and took an oath of them in the house of the Lord, and showed them the king's son. And he commanded, this is the thing that ye shall do. A third part of you that enter in on the Sabbath shall even be keepers of the watch of the king's house. And the third part shall be at the gate of Sur, and the third part at the gate behind the guard. So shall ye keep the watch of the house, that it not be broken down. And 2 parts of you that go forth on the Sabbath, even when they shall keep the watch of the house of the Lord about the king. And ye shall compass the king round about, every man with his weapons in his hands. And he that cometh within the ranges, let him be slain, and be ye with the king as he goeth out and as he cometh in. And the captains over the hundreds did according to all of that Jehoiada the priest commanded. And they took every man his men that were to come in on the Sabbath, with them that should go out on the Sabbath, and came. Captains over hundreds did priests give King David's spears and shields that were in the temple of the Lord. And the guards stood, every man with his weapon in his hand, round about the king, from the right corner of the temple to the left corner of the temple, along by the altar in the temple. And he brought forth the king's son, and put crown upon him, and gave him the testimony, and they made him king, and anointed him, and they clapped their hands and said, God saved the king. So for 6 years now, Joash has been in hiding. Okay, and Jehoiada here, who is the high priest at the time, reveals him to the leaders of the military, reveals him to the royal bodyguards, of Judah, and the kind of the important people of the time. Jehoiada brings Joash to them and shows him that he's here and he's protecting his life. The high priest then plans, as we read there, verses 4 through 12. That is a coronation of the king, right? That's what we just kind of read through there, was him bringing him out and showing him as being kind of the king. Now, we've seen these in movies and TV shows, right? There's this kind of big ordeal of all these people around, and they march the king or the queen, whoever it is out there coordinating, and they have the army around them, the guards, and they kind of place the crown on the head, and then we see God save the king. So we see exactly that in those verses. Right? It's the same thing that we probably have seen before, very similar to what happened here. And they bring him out, and Joash is now the king. Now, the high priest here arms the captains by giving them the actual spears that King David used, his army would have used in the shields as well. Okay? And if you look at verse 10 one more time with me, please, of chapter 11. Before we read that here, what do we think maybe went through the minds of the captains here that are holding the shields of David, essentially protecting the heirs of David? Verse 10 again, and the captains over hundreds did the priests give when they were in the temples of the Lord. So what do you think? What's going through the mind here of these men who were receiving King David's spears and King David's shields as they're protecting the heir of the throne? What do you think maybe some of the thought process they had? Well, if you're in that situation, right? If you're one of those individuals that's getting these spears and these shields of King David in the temple of the Lord, protecting the king, what do you kind of think maybe is going through their mind? That's the big one, right? That's exactly right. God is here. They are being a part of God physically keeping the promise. These royal captains, these royal guards, they would have known about this promise of the line of David. This was not a secret. They would have known this. And they were there, and they were being gifted the shields and the spears of King David himself, and they were actually being part of the very physical history of preserving the line of King David. So I'm sure they understood that, and they understood the magnitude of the situation as well, and kind of how big of a deal that this was, and they're seeing physical evidence of God keeping a promise, which I'm sure a point in life they would have definitely remembered. Because there's this little boy here, right? He's 6, 7, 8 years old, and he's being heavily guarded by the royal captains and the mighty men of Israel here. So it would have been a pretty big deal. Verse 13, and when Mahaliah heard the noise of the guard and of the people, she came to the people into the temple of the Lord. So this coronation of Joash obviously was what? Pretty what? pretty loud, right? This was a pretty big deal, and I'm sure it was. I'm sure you had the men banging, their swords and their shields and kind of all the things that we've seen doing, and they're crying out, "God save the king!" And she hears this, right? It's a pretty noisy affair, and it attracted the attention of Athaliah, and she shows up. Here's what we saw in verse 13. She comes into the temple of the Lord. Verse 14. And when she looked. And behold, the king stood by a pillar, as the manner was, and the princes and the trumpeters by the king, and all the people of the land rejoiced and blew with trumpets. And Athaliah rent her clothes and cried, "Treason, treason." So she's here, she walks into the temple, and she sees this big, huge procession and this big thing going on, right? There's trumpeters up there blowing the horns, and there's surrounded by all these mighty men with all their armor on, and they had the crown on Joash's head, and I'm sure he had some royal attire that he had on as well, kingly attire. And she walks in and she sees this, and the people are crying out that he is the king, and she screams, "Treason, treason," and she tears her clothes off, and you see she's very, very distraught. All right, verse 15. We see the response down to her walking in there. Now the high priest, right, but Jehoiada, the priest, commanded the captains of the what? What's the number there? Captain of the hundreds, the officers of the host, and said unto them, have her forth without ranges, and him that followeth her kill with the sword. For the priest had said, "Let her not be slain in the house of the Lord." And they laid hands on her, and she went by the way by the which the horses came into the king's house, and there she was slain. So at the high priest's command, the Joash's military, the new king's military's guard, killed her by the spears of David. And because of that moment, that taking place of her being slain, Joash was preserved, and as well as the line of David being saved from extinction. Right? Joash was the last one alive. If you get rid of Joash, David's line, and it's written down because he would have, if for some reason Joash would have been killed, the line of David would have been extinct, and the promise of God would not have been held true. So we can see why Satan here is trying to, again, destroy and disrupt the plan of God. All right? Then we get down to verse 17, and we see what happens now as a result of this kind of taking place. And Jehoiada made a covenant between the Lord and the king and the people, that they should be the people between the king also and the people. And all the people of the land will and break it down. His altars and his images break they in pieces thoroughly, and slew Mattan, the priest of Baal, before the altars. And the priest appointed officers over the house of the Lord. And he took the rulers of the hundreds, and the captains, and the guard, and all the people of the land that they brought down, the king from the house of the Lord, and came by the way of the gate of the guard of the king's house, and he sat on the throne of kings. And all the people of the land rejoiced, and the city was in quiet, and they slew Athaliah with a sword beside the king's house. 7 years old was Jehoash when he began to reign. After she was killed, we see what happening in verses 18 and 19 first. What's the very next thing that takes place here? They get rid of all the idols, which means they're doing what?